Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Cole Kopka. I'm the Assistant Director of PacTrans, the Region 10 University Transportation Center, housed at the University of Washington. Thank you for joining us today for our next installment of the PacTrans webinar series on online teaching and learning. Before I introduce our moderator for today, I just wanted to go over the functionalities that you'll find on Zoom with us today. So if you move your cursor over your screen, you'll see two icons at the bottom. The first is raise hand. At the end, when we do Q&A, if you'd like to verbally ask a question, you can click the raise hand button and we can enable you to speak verbally. And so you can ask a question or make a comment that way. The other icon is the Q&A icon. If you click that, a Q&A box will open and you can write questions in there. You can write those questions as we go along, or you can write them at the end when the Q&A portion of the discussion begins. When you see questions in that box, you'll also see a little thumbs up icon at the bottom. That is basically a like icon. If you see a question that you like, you can hit that button and the Q&A box will automatically sort questions by basically how many likes they get so that we know what the majority of the people want to hear about. With that, I'll get started. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Scott from Oregon State University is a professor of civil and construction engineering. Michael, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Cole, for the introduction and for organizing the webinar, and thank you everyone for attending. So as everyone knows, we've been thrust into online learning due to COVID-19. But with today's webinar, we wanted to bring in a couple of experts who've been doing online education for many years and have them provide some insights on best practices for online learning because it looks pretty likely like this will continue in one way or another into the next academic year. Either through some blend of on-campus and online or remote learning. Okay, so our first presenter is Elizabeth McBrien. I'll introduce both presenters and then we'll do the presentations and then questions. But Elizabeth is an instructional designer at Oregon State University eCampus. Her expertise is in STEM fields, STEM subject matters. I've worked with her on a couple of eCampus courses, and she's very good. But she has domestic and international teaching experience and believes that quality course design that meets student and instructors' needs is the key to successful online delivery of courses. Okay, and our second presenter is Dr. Ed McCormack. He's a research associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Washington. He's also the director of the Sustainable Transportation Online Master's Degree program at UW. And this program has 10 instructors and 60 students at any given time. And Ed teaches graduate courses online in transportation planning and infrastructure. Okay, so kind of Elizabeth will go first. We thought that it would be good to kind of have the front end of instructional design and some perspectives there. And then Ed will go second and give his insights on delivery, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So Elizabeth, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the introduction, and hello everyone, welcome. I am thrilled to be here and very excited to share some tips with you in this time for your teaching. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Just have a few slides to go through. There we go. Okay, so as Michael mentioned, I'm an instructional designer at Oregon State University eCampus. And here I collaborate with faculty. Usually it's a 6-month process in developing their online or hybrid course. And before this presentation, I did see some of your questions, and I did see a lot of questions about accessibility, which is fantastic. And I'd love to get to some specific examples of making documents accessible or taking a look at web accessibility features as well, if we have time for that. So, and then also in student engagement, there were a lot of questions about that. So I hope to touch on those topics as well as others. Okay, so a little bit about the context where I'm working at Oregon State University. Oregon State was established in 1868. There are 2 campus locations in Oregon. The main one is in Corvallis, and then we also have one in Bend. Something unique about Oregon State is that we are one of only 2 land, sea, space, and sun grant universities in the US. The other university that can claim this distinction is Penn State. And across all 4 grants, Oregon State literally helps shape the world around us by conducting an integrated program of research, outreach, and education. For the online piece, Oregon State delivers more than 65 degrees and programs online through eCampus, the university's online education provider, in partnership with various colleges and departments on campus. Learners can choose from over 1,300 classes in more than 110 subjects, all developed by OSU's world-class faculty who are known worldwide for their research, expertise, and innovation. And our online learners span the globe with students in all 50 states and more than 50 countries. And since 2002, more than 5,000 students have earned an Oregon State degree online. OSU is ranked number 5 in the nation by US News and World Report for online bachelor's programs. There's also the OSU eCampus Research Unit, which conducts award-winning research in online education. The eCampus Research Unit aims to support colleagues like you with actionable research in online education. So some examples of this include the award-winning online learning efficacy research database, where users can compare the learning outcomes of online and or hybrid education in comparison to face-to-face environments. 2 books, including High Impact Practices in Online Education, Research and Best Practices, and the recently launched The Business of Innovating Online, Practical Tips and Advice from Industry Leaders. There's also the Research in Action podcast, if you prefer listening. So this research and more can be accessed at ecampus.oregonstate.edu/research, and I'll also put this in the resources list at the end. So now I'd like to go back in time a little bit and give a little bit of perspective with this remote teaching that we're doing. So beginning in the 1910s, Oregon Agricultural College, as OSU was known at the time, offered correspondence courses by mail. And this is believed to be the university's first foray into the type of distance education that allows students to learn in their homes or another place of their choosing, rather than an organized location. As early as 1889, Oregon Agricultural College began offering farmers' institutes in towns such as Salem, Roseburg, and Hillsborough to go out there beyond the confines of the Corvallis campus and spread research and academic knowledge to all Oregonians, especially rural Oregon. As part of the land-grant mission, it's important to go to rural areas and now all around the world to support access to education. And this is a picture of locomotive learning from 1911. This is the origins of the OSU Extension Service. So what have we learned from 100 plus years of distance learning and teaching? So I've just kind of compiled a list of kind of foundational elements that I'd like to go through, and then more specifically about the emergency remote teaching that is happening right now. So some help with that. What students have been saying as a reaction to some of this is that they're really preferring asynchronous or hybrid options when possible, and trying to kind of minimize those synchronous real-time face-to-face or Zoom meetings right now, but still have them occasionally, but perhaps not as frequently as we're used to in a face-to-face course. Instructional designers at eCampus use a process called backward design. There are also other processes called things like ADDIE and that kind of thing. We use backward design, where we start with the goals of the course learning outcomes, and then we work backward to select tools and think about the various routes to help students reach those goals. Use accessible materials and content, including technical support for students and how to use the tools that you're providing in courses. We tend to recommend maybe 1 or 2 tools in a course, and not to get too overwhelmed with various tools. give students choices. So allow them to show up in video if they want to, or allow them to perhaps post a picture instead, maybe a picture of themselves or even something that just represents their interests. This could be part of an introduction post, for example. So with engagement, self-reflection, and connection to the self, the real world, facilitating those kinds of connections can really help students feel engaged and feel motivated in the course. Organizing content by weeks rather than by like having an assignments module or a readings module, organizing things by week and keeping everything together by week really helps students navigate the course and cuts down on frustration when they're trying to find something. As far as assessment goes, it's important to give lots of practice opportunities before assessments are given. So time for students, things like unlimited quiz attempts, for example, can give practice for students before they take a more formal assessment. Formative and summative assessments, things like formative assessments where you're giving a lecture and you interrupt the lecture with a poll every 15 minutes to kind of gauge how well students are understanding things. That gives you an idea of how they're doing, and it also gives themselves an idea of how they're doing with these concepts. And then the summative assessment is happening towards the end of a unit. So this could be a test or an essay or a project. Also on the topic of assessments, so instead of maybe the proctored test that we're used to, some alternative assessments that help minimize academic integrity violations could be e-portfolios, written responses that have unique answers, that kind of thing, projects, presentations, and then breaking up these large projects into milestones so that students aren't overwhelmed by a huge project all of a sudden that they haven't even started on and panic and go cheat or something like that. Okay, so I wanted to focus specifically on engaging students as well. This was one of the questions that kept coming up. So for this, the student-instructor relationship is one of the most important, if not the most important factors in learning and engagement. So some easy ways to do this: welcome each student to your course. So take the time to, if you have a discussion board, welcome each student after they've posted their introduce yourself discussion. Build trust with students with timely responses. Reach out to students, ask how they're doing if you haven't heard from someone. The connections, like I said, are crucial for learning, and create a welcoming atmosphere where mistakes can be made. So acknowledge that perhaps you are using a tool for the first time. Actually, we were just talking about this before the webinar started, that it's okay for us to look human too and make some mistakes, and model that for our students and model that lifelong learning. And again, so making anything personally meaningful that you can really help the material be engaging. So that one way to do this is before the lecture starts, tell students that they're going to do a 3-2-1 reflection, which comes from Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa. And that's where the students are responsible for, at the end of the lecture, maybe this is something they put in the chat box or they send later in an assignment, 3 things that are new for them that they learned, 2 things that they're so excited about they want to keep researching or they're going to tell someone about, and 1 thing that connects in some way to their own lives or to something that's happening right now. Okay, so I want to touch just for a second on remote teaching issues and some things that have come up. So usually with online courses, we're developing this in a really thoughtful way over months. And so this remote teaching has caused a lot of disruptions in that process for faculty who've never taught online before. So students are experiencing Zoom fatigue and internet stress. So I talked a little bit about how to use, really thoughtful use of those synchronous sessions, what can be put online asynchronously. The expectations are unclear, so it's not clear when the instructor's available for contact, that kind of thing. So make those boundaries available to students, communicate regularly and consistently. So have a rhythm to the course. So for example, have quizzes every Wednesday, discussion board posts due every Sunday, major assignments due every Monday, something like that. And then a last problem that we've heard about is uneven workload from week to week, and then also putting way too much on the course LMS or like something like Canvas. So putting, 5 readings when maybe 2 would be okay, or having 5 readings and guiding students to a specific area of the reading. For example, say focus on the discussion portion of this scholarly article, and guide them around, that kind of thing. And also putting time estimates around things can really help. So here's a reading, it takes about 10 minutes, that kind of thing. Okay, so I wanted to stop here, but I'd love to get to some accessibility questions if you all have them, and turn it over to Ed. And thank you so much. Stop sharing here.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Next up, we have Ed McCormack. Ed, whenever you're ready, please go. Need to unmute. We're human, right?
Okay, you can hear me now. So like, we were talking about online teaching doesn't always go completely smoothly, but you just kind of work your way through it and it works. So thanks a lot to PacTrans for giving us an opportunity to talk about online teaching. And Elizabeth did a really good job of kind of talking about how you set up online courses. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of teaching. I've been doing online programs for maybe 10 years. And I direct a Master's Sustainable Transportation program, which is actually developed as an online program. And this program, actually, we have really great support here at the University of Washington because we have professional and continuing education, which has been doing this kind of thing, not completely online, but continuing education for over 100 years. So we also have some really good instructional designers to help us develop our online content. I want to talk a little bit. My experience here is mainly for graduate classes for up to 25 people. So I think online teaching is a little bit of a different experience if you have maybe an undergrad class with 50 or 60 people. But so my perspective is going to be sort of more of the smaller classes. Now in the past, I've taught asynchronous classes, which none of the class is real time. It's all basically online. I've taught synchronous classes, which real time, and you can have an online synchronous class. You can have like a Zoom session and go back and forth. I've taught hybrid classes, which the Master of Sustainable Transportation is hybrid because we have a lot of not real-time content. We also have a Zoom session tied in the class. And I really very much like the hybrid approach because it's a lot more flexible. You get students that to do the work offline, and you can actually have really dynamic online discussions. They got to talk with the instructor and things like that. I guess the other thing I've noticed in my years of doing online teaching is it really works amazingly well. In the online program I run, we do an evaluation every year of the graduating students, and we always get lots of comments. They come in the program, a lot of concern about how well the online format's going to work, but we get these great comments like online quickly becomes second nature, and the software used for the program is really effective at engaging students and promoting participating in remote classroom format. So almost universally, all the students end up pretty comfortable with the online format and pretty happy with the learning experience. Now let me talk a little bit about, a lot of us have been forced into online teaching sort of abruptly and suddenly. And I think one way to look at it is it provides a lot of really great opportunities. One thing we've noticed in our online program is that you can put different learning styles into an online class. And we've noticed, for example, that the students that talk a lot, when we're doing a Zoom session, they participate in the live discussions are not necessarily the same students that will participate in the online the discussions sort of built into the course, the non-live discussions. So, you can, shy students maybe like to type more, outgoing students maybe like to talk more, but you get participation from both of these types of students. And of course, if you have an online program, you have a lot of flexibility, both as a student and as an instructor. You can do a lot of your material on your own schedule, your own time, post it. The students can look at it in their own time and own schedule. And one thing, for example, I've noticed students like is they take a lecture and they watch it at 1.5 speed so they can get through it quicker. I also think the classroom software such as Canvas is really efficient. You can embed everything you need in the class, your readings, your quizzes, your discussions, your announcements into the Canvas software. So you have kind of one-stop shopping for the students and for the instructors set up the course. So I think that's pretty effective. Another really great thing that we're doing more and more in the Master's Student Transportation program is we're flipping the classroom. So the instructors pre-record the lectures and the students view it online on their own schedule, and then they use the in-class time to actually have discussions based on the lecture. And that seems to result in pretty dynamic, pretty interesting discussions instead of just a instructor lecturing. It seems to work very, very well. Other thing that's really great about online teaching is that it really widens your access to material and sources. For example, in my class, I have the president of the American Society of Civil Engineers come as a guest lecturer, and he's not in Seattle. He's on the East Coast, but he come and talk to my class, and you couldn't do that in a regular classroom format. And of course, you have access to online sources, and typically you also have students in geographically diverse places, so you have students in kind of different experiences that can bring into the classroom because they're in an online format. Now, let me talk a little bit about, your response. You have to do an online class, maybe you've never done one before. So I think really important is to focus on your content, right? A good class is a good class, whether it's in a classroom or in some sort of online format, and not just the platform. So, that's kind of fundamental, but I've seen a number of people make mistakes and they're really focused on how they're going to do it online and not the content. And, if you traditionally have been doing work in a classroom, you can't just record your 50-minute lecture. That doesn't really work very well in an online format because you're not getting feedback from the students and you're just not connecting with the students when you do a 50-minute lecture, if you can avoid it. It's really helpful to set up your entire course in advance, if possible. I understand, that's hard to do. And as Elizabeth indicated, if you set up your course in advance, you can break it down into weeks and you can have some sort of rhythm. You can have a quiz every Monday or something like that. And it just sort of really helps the students stay up to speed and understand expectations, kind of get into the course. It's also really easy in an online format, again, as Elizabeth indicated, to throw a lot of material into the course. Oh, there's another reading, I'll just add that URL. So you got to think about having a reasonable course structure. You got to have, consistent due dates. You got to have the right number of readings, not too many. So I think it's in an online course, it's easier to throw in too much material because sometimes you don't get the same feedback from students you do if you're in front of them. So you got to think about that. A concern that I hear frequently is also in an online course, there's less oversight maybe, and there's a greater opportunity to minimize cheating, but I've never really found that a big problem. For example, one thing I do is in some of my courses, I have an open book exam at the end of the course, but I time it. That way the students can, use all the materials, they can use the lectures, but they have to understand the material enough that they can go in and do it in 1 hour or 2 hours or however I time it for. I also find that group projects where students work together kind of reduces, just makes the opportunities to cheat a little bit less popular or common because you're working together. Now, a very important aspect for online teaching is I think you need to actively provide support and feedback. I call it the humanization of the course. You need to be present to these online students. And an important part of this is use your video, right? They can see you, and they can see you make mistakes, you're human. It's important, for any professor or any instructor to be accessible. So I always provide email and phone access. So a student can email me and say, hey, Ed, I'm concerned, I want to learn this content. And oftentimes I'll do a private Zoom session. I'll just get on the phone with them. I find using the announcement function is well received. So I'll announce things, hey, everybody, remind you that there's a project due next week. You have any questions? Or hey, everybody, you want to check this reading out. Just sort of constantly be in contact with the students. And I also, in the classroom session, you can talk to students, and sometimes I'll send them private emails. I have some concerns or some comments on them. And of course, you want to facilitate both online and live discussions just to keep the class lively and interesting. Another thing I have noticed is that our students really don't like long lectures. They have short attention spans. And so I always break my recorded presentations into short, 15-minute chunks. I mean, they might be part 1, part 2, part 3. So a student can look at a presentation, maybe go do something else and come back to the second presentation, thing like that. That's always been pretty well received. So, and then the sort of the mechanics of online teaching, and a lot of this has been kind of hard learned lessons. Audio matters, right? You're out there instructing, students want to hear you. In my program, I require a good USB headset, kind of like I have on here, with a boom mic, and mine has sound suppressing. And I also personally like an inline mute, so I don't have to go to the keyboard. I can mute as I talk. You know, you can get good sound quality with other forms of technology, but I've never had these headphones fail, and they're only like 25 or 30 bucks. So I think they're a good idea. Another thing I really encourage my instructors to do is have 2 screens. So when you're facilitating a class, you have one screen with your presentation on it, and you have your other screen to monitor participants and the chat box and whatever else is going on. So I think that makes it much easier to kind of, you know, you're running a little show here, and so you need 2 screens to do it. Another trick that I know some of us have done, even like for this presentation, is you can also have yet another screen in a little laptop off in the corner of the room, and you can log in as a student. You can see what's showing up on that screen, so you kind of see what the students are seeing. I always open my class early with an agenda on the screen. Particularly, it's really important when you're starting up the class so the students know they're in the right place and they're kind of comfortable. Yeah, you know, this is where I'm supposed to be. And so, and it kind of, there's been a few times that I've opened up the class and something hasn't worked and I've had to scramble, but I've opened up early and I managed to get the class rolling in time. With my smaller classes, I always do a microphone check with each student. So they log on, I say, you know, hey, Kathy, how you doing? And just kind of also gives me a chance to connect with the student. It indicates that they can talk and participate in the class. And so, you know, you might get one student says, well, my mic doesn't work this time, but you keep doing that, you know, you keep checking with them the next session or the third session, they're going to have a mic that works. I find particularly with, you know, this generation of students, they really like the chat. In fact, in some of our classes, the chat's actually more active in the live session, I think, because people are used to, you know, they're just used to texting. So I like the chat option. I like the Q&A option a little bit, but I like the chat option better because the students can talk to each other. I can watch discussions unfold. And then finally, I just like to start and end on time, you know, because typically when you do an online session, people can, you know, I can hop on in a minute, but you know, if you start on time and people understand you start on time, they tend more often to, you know, be there when you start class. And I think that helps. And of course, you know, on the other end of things, I don't go late. I tend to go on time. And that's always been commented on in the evaluations and appreciate it. So that's kind of what I have. So I guess back to you, Michael.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. And again, thank you, Elizabeth, for these 2 very informative presentations. So at this point, we'll open it up to questions. There's been a couple questions that have come through the Q&A feature. And it looks like they've been answered in writing, but we could probably maybe verbally kind of go through these questions just so everybody hears it. So there was one question on, is too much reading really unique to online teaching? I think Elizabeth mentioned something about, you know, do maybe 2 readings where, you know, 5 is too much, but maybe 2 would suffice. I think that's where this question kind of came from. But, you know, students also complain about this in on-campus learning as well. So Elizabeth, do you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit more to the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, this is definitely something I hear from faculty pretty frequently. And I think one thing that can really help is to set those expectations up from the beginning with students about how much they're supposed to participate in the course. This could look like perhaps a survey. How much do you think you're going to be spending on, you know, working on this course each week? And then, you know, let them know that we'll have for a 3-credit course, that's about 9 hours of work a week. That's including readings and watching lectures and doing homework and studying, that kind of thing. And so I think that helps take care of things quite a bit. There are also some things that you can do to integrate reading activities with interaction with students and kind of combine some activities. So there are some annotation tools, for example, where students can collaboratively annotate a reading on the web or a file that you've uploaded. And so that could count as a discussion as well as kind of accountability for the reading. so that the students are going in and they're annotating right in the reading together. They can see each other's responses, they can see your replies, and you can make it private or a collaborative activity. And so that kind of is a nice option compared to like reading quizzes, because they're working with each other, they're building their learning community, they're building relationships, rather than, you know, an isolated read this, take a quiz. That's kind of isolating for students sometimes. So it's nice to kind of mix it up with readings and guide them through the important parts of a reading. If you really want them to read the whole thing, you know, state that, or if you want them to focus on a section, state that. Just like in a face-to-face course, you know, you wouldn't just silently hand out readings and then walk away. You would give some context around it. So in an online course as well, you'd want to give a little context about, here's this reading, this is why I've chosen it. I want you to focus on this part, take notes while you're reading, or, you know, you're going to want to refer back to this later for your project or whatever it is. So really provide that context online that you would normally give in person in your course.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. I guess there's another question about concerns that students in a flipped classroom format will not view the recorded lecture ahead of the discussion, kind of maybe hoping to pick up the information on the fly during the discussion. Ed, maybe if you have any experience on that. And
Yeah.
Elizabeth answered it in chat, but then maybe she can add on after you, Ed, here.
Sure. I think that you can, you're in a flipped classroom, when you're starting to talk about, well, I grade on participation right off the bat. So if a student has done the lecture, hasn't viewed the lecture, they're not going to do a very good job of participating in the discussion. And so that's a pretty good incentive to read the discussion or view the discussion. So I really haven't found that too much of a problem. I also do reading comprehension quizzes sometimes, so that assumes they do the reading, and I think that you can kind of pair that with the lecture too and get participation by the student. But it hasn't been a big issue in my class. There's also, Michael, there's a question about students liking the chat. Should I answer that too?
Yeah, maybe let's go ahead and jump in. I guess everybody can see Elizabeth's written response to that. So we could come back to that if we have time, but yeah, there's a question on the chat, so about chat. So Ed,
yeah, and that's simply as setting expectations right up front. I mean, if people start to go off on extraneous chats, you just get back on chat, or you just say, hey, you know, we want to stay back on the content of the course. You do that a few times, and over the sweep of the course, the problem goes away, is my experience. So first class, you just need to set expectations.
Yeah, to add on, thanks Ed, that's great. And to add on to that, I think Michael, you mentioned a tip for high enrollment courses once about where you can have a TA or some sort of moderator to help with the chat. So I think that's a great idea too. And it can also be for students who, you know, maybe they didn't hear something or they want to know more. What was that researcher's name? That kind of thing. They can put that in the chat and the TA can address that so that the student can keep listening as well, keep focused.
Okay. Let's see, there's another question. During portions of your classes that are more lecture, what are your best practices for keeping students engaged and involved? Maybe Ed, you can field this one. And
yes.
Then, yeah.
I don't do much different than I do in a live classroom class. I'll stop and I'll say, anybody have any questions? And if nobody answers, I'll pick on somebody. I'll say, hey, you know, what do you think? And then what does somebody else think? And I'm not afraid to just sit there and wait for a minute. Usually somebody, you know, just kind of can't stand it response. So it's the same thing I do in the classroom. You know, and I throw out interesting questions, and I get students to answer them, and I just try and get a discussion going, which is kind of, you know, one of the reasons I like the flipped classroom is because they've already seen the lecture, and then you can have the discussion. The students know they have to talk and be engaged, and like I said, I grade on participate, so they have an incentive to be engaged, so it works.
Yeah, and that's great. And I completely agree. And you can actually see everybody's names too in Zoom. So you don't have to memorize 150 students' names. You can just start calling on them right away.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a really kind of a hot topic question that came through. We've seen complaints from students in the news that they want in-person learning because many seem to feel that online is kind of an inferior second-class learning experience. So how do you suggest overcoming this perception? Maybe Elizabeth can start with this one, or what eCampus, because there's also kind of two different groups of students, right? Those who choose online education, and then also those that are thrown into it or feel that they
Well, skepticism of online, gosh, I've never heard that before. I've heard that before. And I think Shannon Riggs said it pretty well recently. She said, talking about the faculty side of things, so online educators sensitive to skepticism about the efficacy of online education are concerned that faculty who have negative perceptions of online education will associate problems with emergency remote education with non-emergency online course design and teaching. And higher education professionals have cautioned against equating remote and online delivery methods. And I think that that's important too, to share that information with students, that this is an emergency solution to a unique problem. And if you want to do an fully online course, it's typically pretty well planned out, and that's not where we're getting negative feedback from students. Those are the courses where, the really fully online courses that have been developed thoughtfully and over time, those are kind of business as usual for both students and for faculty. And so it's really that emergency shift that we're seeing a lot of upset, and some of it has to do with accessibility issues and things that are real barriers for students, where we're asking faculty to do everything that normally a collaborative team would do for an online course at where I work at eCampus. So it's quite a big lift, and it definitely understandable that there are some complaints with it. So I think that's kind of my 2 cents about that. But Ed, what do you think about that?
Yeah, you nailed it there. I mean, you can't just take a regular class and dump it in an online format. You need to think about the online component. And I've never really had problems with students thinking online learning is second nature, but my students have come into an online program. I think it goes back to humanization. You just want to connect with the students and be accessible and make yourself visible and talk to them. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Okay, I know, Ed, you kind of touched on this a little bit with your presentation, and Elizabeth did as well, but what are maybe some more details on interesting or effective ways to do group projects? I guess Ed, maybe start on this one.
Sure. Well, like Zoom has breakout rooms, which a lot of my instructors like, and it's very effective. So you can push students into different rooms, let them work on projects. Some of the program instructors have offline group projects, and all the students now have access to Zoom, so they get together and do Zoom together. So I don't find it's too much more of a lift than a regular classroom project. The students can get together online as well as they can get together in person. And even in the classroom classes, I find that students are using online format to get together and COVID. So it's not a big. I haven't found it a big problem.
Okay, Elizabeth, do you have anything to add on group or maybe more on group projects that are, of course, stretched out over time? With I guess with each kind of meeting, you can do the breakout rooms, but you talked about milestones and kind of spreading out the work.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. I think group projects can be wonderful. And I know that it's tricky because students often really resist working in groups. And so some things that I recommend for group projects for the faculty member, providing guidance around giving choices for how students can meet. So, you can give maybe a few different tools for them to choose to meet over. Here's Zoom that you have access to for setting up meetings. I'd like you to meet, this frequently, for example. Let them know that there will be a feedback form at the end, so they can kind of give feedback about how well their group members participated. Let them know that you're there if they run into problems, but don't hover, you know, don't micromanage them, but give them autonomy, but still let them know that you're there and you're going to be inviting their feedback at the end. Think about pacing. So as kind of Michael mentioned, some milestones. What we've seen before in courses where students tend to drop out is that there's suddenly a week where they have to do 5 huge things and they get overwhelmed and they can't do them. So break up, you know, what are the tasks they're going to need to do? They're going to need to, you know, form their group. They're going to need to meet, help them through establishing those kind of critical pieces of their group work, and then let them go from there, knowing that there will be feedback gathered at the end.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question on, you know, how do we really motivate students to do, or to interact and become engaged? Like the classroom interactions in person are very important for getting engaged, or for keeping students engaged. But are there any, like, maybe specific? I know we've kind of touched on it, but, you know, maybe some little more on how we motivate students to interact in the online learning environment. Like they may resist it, but, you know, what do we do to motivate them? Ed?
Yeah, so like
yeah.
I've already mentioned, like great participation. I'm not afraid to tap students when I'm in an online format and ask them. I also make, like I said, I make the opportunity to participate in a discussion forum offline an option in a lot of my classes. And I have mandatory online, you know, I have mandatory discussion forums too. So the students in my program tend to participate because they have to, and it actually works pretty well. So, you know.
Yeah, okay. Anything to add, Elizabeth, or?
Yeah, with motivation, I mean, I think kind of like I mentioned, you know, I think anytime you can help students make things personally meaningful, that really goes a long way with motivation. You know, helping them establish their goals for the course, or how it relates to their professional goals, for example, that can really help with motivation. And also just removing barriers for them, you know, giving them choices for how they demonstrate their mastery of something. This is part of principles of universal design for learning that instructional designers use. So giving them, you know, a choice. Maybe you have the same rubric for a project, but they could present their findings and demonstrate their mastery that way, or they could write an essay or something like that. So, but then you're still looking for those same kinds of, you know, goals that they've met, but they're showing you in different ways. So that can be nice, giving them choices and just helping them, you know, understand how it relates to their lives. I think that with subject matter experts, you know, we're so steeped in our discipline, it's really hard to remember that students don't always see the connections that we see. And so I think that, you know, showing them how it relates to the real world, or showing them, you know, guiding them through questions that they can discover how it relates to their own lives, can be meaningful and motivating.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of along the lines of group projects. What kind of tools do you recommend to use for collaborative online projects, like MS Whiteboard, or are there tools in Canvas that can kind of, I know we've talked about group projects and breakout rooms, but, you know, kind of what's the technology that really brings the students together? There's some annotation features, perhaps, I believe were mentioned earlier, but any more details on those types of tools?
I have a real short answer for that.
Okay.
We don't use those tools for a couple. I mean, we find Zoom and Canvas is enough. Canvas has a mail option. It has a discussion option. Students all have Zoom accounts. They can Zoom with each other. And part of that is, you know, I have 10 instructors and I don't really like to throw new software at them because it always seems to cause problems. And, you know, Zoom and Canvas seems to be enough, and email and that kind of thing. So,
okay.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ed. I think it's, you know, the tool isn't going to solve everything for you, and it's I think important to keep it simple. And so, yeah, I agree. You know, discussion boards can help with small groups, with getting the ball rolling with that kind of thing. And you can also see how it's going when they're in discussion boards. Google Docs, that kind of thing, Zoom, that's already there. That's usually enough. There are other asynchronous tools like Voicethread that can be added to courses, and this is an asynchronous way for students to discuss. You can also lecture through Voicethread, where there are video options. You can call in to leave a response. You can use a text response. It's pretty robust, so that's a nice option too for group work. I've seen groups do presentations through Voicethread and do their like peer review through Voicethread, that kind of thing too. So those are some tools, but I think just a caution with tools is kind of think about what your goals are and then choose a tool rather than, okay, here's my tool, how am I going to fit it into my course? That causes problems sometimes. So that backward design of here's my goal, what do I need to provide students so they can get there?
Okay, next question is a very timely one. So what should students do when a professor is assigning unreasonable levels of work, and it's clear that the professor is perhaps not addressing the needs of the students, maybe not listening to the students' feedback, especially considering the current pandemic and protests that are going on, and the stress that it can cause students? You know, what are some of the avenues of, you know, kind of addressing student work that students can use to maybe get this taken care of, I guess, for lack of a better term. If anybody wants to attack, maybe some administrative routes that students could take.
Yeah.
Don't go to the dean, but maybe one level.
I don't see this as any different problem between an in-classroom and an online class. If if a student's unhappy with the teacher, there should be some sort of administrative pathway for that student to complain. So I don't see a big difference there. In our courses, we do a mid-course evaluation, so we kind of get some feedback if things aren't going right and we have a problem with teachers. And I think a good instructor will try and get feedback from the students occasionally. How am I doing? How's this work? So I think that's just kind of a overall educational issue.
And I think this question may have been kind of coming from perhaps, like we mentioned earlier, some with the huge pivot to remote learning, I can just add on some extra modules, or I can add some extra content because it's there, but, without realizing that it is a burden to the students. Elizabeth, anything to add?
Yeah, I think if this, if this is maybe a colleague concerned about another colleague, maybe, I think a gentle way to approach it is to just talk about the numbers side of things. So things like, maybe sharing your experience, like, wow, I put my course online and I was looking at how much work students are actually having to do. And I realized that when I added everything up, I was expecting them to do about 12 hours of work and, 4 hours of reading, when really, I guess I should be aiming for this. And so I think, kind of getting down to, we should be, if you're a course coordinator, for example, we should be aiming for this number of hours of work. And I'd like everyone to try to put in time estimates, that kind of thing, and maybe talk about the ways that you've been flexible with students. That can perhaps open the door to some of these conversations, and be empathetic to colleagues who, might not realize that they're doing this. It's a difficult time for students and for faculty. So yeah, it's a great time to practice empathy, I think, for everybody.
Okay, there's a question about students perhaps not choosing to activate their cameras or their microphones during synchronous sessions. Is this disconcerting in a way to the instructor? Are there ways to mitigate this? I think, Ed, you've dealt with this quite a bit. Or just kind of accept that there are maybe equity issues in the remote learning paradigm that we should allow this preference to be okay.
Yeah, and initially in my program, I really asked students to have cameras, but after talking to students, I realized that students they're at home, they got things going on in the background, they have kids. Some of them are embarrassed by where they live, and so I no longer require cameras. I say, if you're doing a presentation, it'd be really great if you have a camera, and most students do that, but it's not, for privacy issues and just complicated things going on in the background, I don't require cameras anymore. But that being said, almost all students have cameras that they use. They just turn them off, and then when they're talking, they turn them on or presenting.
Okay. And then maybe this might be a good one for Elizabeth. How do you assess the proper class size for online learning? The person who posed the question said, I heard mention of 25 per class and larger lectures of 50 or more. Like, is that a good class size? I mean, is there a good class size, or does it matter? Or in what ways does it matter what the class size is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm happy to hear being so thoughtful about it. And yeah, I think that most of the courses that I work on, it's under 35 students, I would say. And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about it necessarily, but I think it would change the way that you're facilitating the course. So for really quite large enrollment courses, or even a course with 30, 40 students, I would, still recommend welcoming everyone to the course, but then, in later discussions, be there, read the students' responses. But a way to save time is to, send out an announcement to the course at the end of the week rather than jumping into every discussion and posting. So perhaps you would pull out one or two excellent responses and send those out and say, this group really nailed it. Definitely use small groups in your discussions for those high enrollment courses, and experiment with things. Tell your students you're going to experiment with things. Ask for feedback, like Ed and Michael mentioned, a survey about how things are going. That can be a great way to, really get feedback from your students. It's a great way to learn about teaching online as well. But yeah, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but I think that you would be prepared to make adjustments in your facilitation based on the number of students.
Okay. Ed, anything to add, or?
No, I think you did a great job, Elizabeth, explaining that.
Okay. So this is probably embedded in the presentations, but I guess just to reiterate, this person's asking, what do you think are the most valuable inherent strengths of online delivery? And which of those should we be sure to take advantage of?
Glenn, if you don't mind, I can start. I touched on that in my presentation. I think one of the really great things is that you can pull in people from any place to participate in your class. You can have guest lecturers from wherever. I also think the flexibility of online teaching is really great. It kind of appeals to a group of students that maybe, like in my online program, a lot of my students are working. They can't come to the university and take classes, but they can still get a degree from the university. So there's some flexibility there. And as I also indicated, you also can get the sort of address the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of teacher or students, outgoing students who like to talk, and the students who are more likely to type and text. So I think those are some of the strengths of it. I particularly like the flexibility of it. So you can do the coursework when it works for you and when it works for the students.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, yeah, I just want to second, yeah, the flexibility, absolutely, and just the efficiency of it. If you think about what goes into your lecture in a 50-minute course, you're coming into class, you're asking how people are doing, which is great rapport building, and the back and forth questions are there, but they're just moved to a different area in an online course, maybe discussion board, or to annotate it, collaborative annotation or something. And so, you can really trim the fat on those lectures and have them really polished and, or at least just there. And so, yeah, efficiency, I think, is great. And students, like Ed said, the average age of an eCampus student is, I think it's 31 years old right now. So they definitely, you know, they're working full time, they have families, they wouldn't necessarily be able to go back to school without online. So I think it really, I think that the greatest thing with online is expanding access to students who wouldn't otherwise be able to get this kind of education. So I think that that's just so, it's just, you know, amazing and wonderful. And that's part of the reason that we're passionate about teaching online and being involved in that, is providing access to educational opportunities.
Okay, so there's a probably tough, short question with a tough answer, but I'll probably send this one to Elizabeth because you've done some STEM courses developed. But how do you suggest dealing with laboratory sections in an online course?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's, I mean, such a range of laboratory opportunities with online. I think that it's a wonderful opportunity for science courses to show students that science is everywhere and it's all around us. And there are labs, everything from kitchen labs that are sent to homes. I mean, Fisheries and Wildlife Program, they send, you know, fish dissection kits to people's homes and things like that. And I mean, yeah, for a veterinary histology course I'm working on right now, the active learning component for the labs is that the students are looking at the slides, the tissue slides, and they're drawing what they see, or they're giving a description of what they see, so that they're really analyzing those tissues and finding out what they look like, because they're supposed to be able to recognize those different tissues for animals and things like that. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get creative. And you know, when you hear that voice that says, oh, this can't be done, try to set that aside and say, you know, how can we do this? Or what do I want students to learn? And there are a lot of ways to help students with labs in many forms. So, yeah.
Okay, very good. Let's see, there's a question on accessibility. So as hearing aid wearer, I find myself more distracted by video than helped by it when it comes to lip reading, due to resolution and bandwidth issues usually. So it's, you know, better to turn off the video and, you know, just kind of listen to or let you simply focus on the words. Sorry. Do you generally find that presenters do better when they focus on enunciation and slowing down just slightly? Is there any coaching you can offer to presenters or online deliverers of information to kind of make their presentations more accessible by slowing down? I know when towards the end of time, I start to go really fast on lectures, whether it's in person or online. But yeah, what value is there, or what are the best tips for, you know, in terms of accessibility, in terms of pacing lectures? Maybe Elizabeth may have some experience with this.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, you know, the classic example here is captioning. And one reason that we have captions, of course, is for people who are hearing impaired, but also it's great for technical disciplines where there's vocabulary that students need to learn how to spell and things like that. It's great for that. It sounds like, you know, I think it's pretty standard to have the captioning, though. I think that's going to be the way that, you know, you're really going to help students who are hearing impaired, is to have captions. And there are a lot of automated captioning tools out there. And also I think Zoom does now do automatic captioning as well. So yeah, I would investigate captioning definitely for this. And that's kind of the nice thing about online as well. With lectures, you know, students can pause them. If they didn't hear, they can go back, they can look at the captions, they can turn them on and off. And otherwise, I would say provide a transcript as well for lectures.
Yeah, and Scott, thanks for the reminder. I tend to, like Michael, get going too fast and talk too fast. So it's good to know that, you know, even when you're on a Zoom session, you want to have clarity and enunciation. And I guess the other thing I say is, like, we record all our lectures, so I think there's also an opportunity to go back and review things if you know, somebody didn't get part of it too. So I hope that would be helpful too.
Okay, looks like one more question. So I guess we talked about some of the tools for collaboration, and it seemed like Canvas and Zoom pretty much get 90% of the way, or you know, pretty much do a lot of things. But are there any tools specifically for engagement in a class? Menti or ideas, and what platform? Or I mean, I guess most of the courses are delivered through Zoom, but are there any other tools for specifically for engagement? I guess that's kind of what this question is getting at. I mean, we've talked about collaboration, but also engagement. Are there any extras that you know of that can be done?
Within Zoom, I like the polling feature, and I like the breakout feature. So like we talked about, I think Zoom really does a pretty good job for what we need to do in terms of engagement.
Yeah, I think polling, that's a great idea. Polling is great for engagement and also gives you an idea of how students are doing. The tools that I mentioned for collaborative annotation, one is Hypothesis, and that one is an open source tool, and that you can annotate anything on the web. It's just a plugin for your browser. And then the other one, and you can also integrate it into your LMS. And then the other one is Perusal, that's quite popular. So you can actually link up, if you're using a textbook in your course, you can link up Perusal and have a lot of features with annotating your textbook collaboratively and you know, either assigning individual activities or group activities, small group activities. So there are a lot of options there. And yeah, I would say yeah, the human side of things that's going to be where you get that engagement, and then the tool really facilitates that.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we're at the end of the hour, and there's no more questions in the Q&A chat, and which is just great timing. Well, one more question. Maybe one more question trickled in, but you know, if anybody needs to go, you know, please go from the audience. Don't let us hold you, but if you can stick around for another minute or two, we'll wrap things up and answer this. One more question just came in about spell out tools. So I guess this is maybe spelling out the tools you just mentioned, Elizabeth, Hypothesis and Perusal, I guess. Is that what it was? Maybe it was heard as carousel. It looks like, I heard Perusal.
All right, yeah, Perusal. Yeah, Perusal is spelled slightly differently. It's like peruse, all ALL at the end. So PERUSALL, perusal.com. And then the other one is Hypothesis. Hypothesis.com, I think it is. So yeah, I think if you just Google them, they're kind of one of the major ones. So yeah, those should pop right up.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. So again, I want to thank Elizabeth and Ed for giving tons of insights today. Hopefully this gets everybody prepared for what's coming in the fall. You know, likely some blend of on-campus and online delivery. I'd like to, you know, thank PacTrans for sponsoring this webinar and organizing the webinar. It's been a pleasure, been fun, and I'll turn it back over to Cole at this point to wrap things up. And,
yeah, just one really quick note. We've had a few questions in the Q&A box, as well as I've had a few emails during the course of the webinar. We will make the slide decks that were used today available. And we will also publish the recording of this webinar on our website at pactrans.org. So once the recording is published, I will send an email to everyone who registered that will have the specific link to that video, as well as both Ed and Elizabeth's slide decks. I'd like to echo Michael's thank you for everyone participating. It was really great. Lots and lots and lots of information to marinate on. And with that, I think we will conclude. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Mhm.